Brad Collins pulled Lance Norwood and his daughter onto the stage, holding out an envelope in front of nearly 300 former classmates. He announced that they had invited the black single father back, only so he could have one decent dinner and enough money to buy his daughter new clothes. Laughter spread through the ballroom. Then the hotel manager walked up, bowed slightly toward Lance, and said the entire building belonged to him. The laughter died instantly. And that was only the first secret of the night. Before we go any further, if stories like this keep you hooked, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's go back to where it all began. 20 years before that envelope was ever placed in his hands, Lance Norwood arrived at Glenville University carrying a duffel bag that had belonged to his uncle and a scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else. He worked overnight shifts stocking shelves at a grocery store just off campus, then walked into 8 a.m. lectures running on almost no sleep. Most of his classmates came from families who had already mapped out their futures for them, and Lance quickly understood that he did not belong to that world. No matter how hard he studied, Brad Collins noticed him almost immediately, not because Lance stood out, but because he didn't. Brad's father ran a regional trucking company, and Brad had grown up believing that money was the only language worth speaking. He started calling Lance class loser within the first month of freshman year, and the nickname spread through the dormitories faster than Lance could defend himself against it. Brad tore pages out of Lance's notebooks before exams, hid his textbooks the night before presentations, and made sure Lance was never invited to the networking dinners where real opportunities were quietly handed out. Derek Hayes lived 2 doors down from Brad that first year, and for a long time he told himself he was simply staying out of it. He watched Brad humiliate Lance in the dining hall more than once, watched other students laugh along because laughing was easier than saying something. One night Derek almost turned to Brad and told him to stop, the words already forming in his mouth, but he swallowed them instead, afraid of losing his place in a friend group that mattered more to him at 20 than it ever would again. He never forgot that moment, even after he told himself he had. The only person who treated Lance like an equal was Naomi Carter, a nursing student who sat next to him in a required science class simply because the seat happened to be open. She never once looked at him with pity. She saw a young man who read further into every assignment than the professor asked for, who spoke carefully because he had learned that his words were judged more harshly than anyone else's. Naomi started saving him a seat on purpose after that, and neither of them ever called it anything more than friendship until it clearly was. They married 2 years after graduation, in a small ceremony that neither of their families could afford to make bigger, and their daughter Maya was born the following spring. For 3 years, Lance built the earliest version of his software company at night, hunched over a second-hand laptop after Naomi had gone to sleep, chasing an idea about fixing broken supply chains that nobody else seemed to think was worth funding. Then Naomi got sick, quickly and without warning, and within a matter of months she was gone, leaving Lance alone with a 3-year-old daughter and a bank account that barely covered rent. He never spoke about those years to anyone outside his own house. He raised Maya while investors closed doors on him one after another, several of them saying outright that a single father could not be trusted to run a company the way it needed to be run. He kept building anyway, taking meetings from library corners with Maya's stroller parked beside his chair, writing code between diaper changes and bedtime stories, refusing every suggestion that he choose between his daughter and the thing he was building. Slowly, without anyone at Glenville noticing, that stubbornness turned into something enormous, though Lance made sure it stayed invisible to almost everyone who had known him before. He stopped attending alumni events years ago, stopped updating any profile that might tell his old classmates where he had ended up. Without anything to see, the people from Glenville simply filled in the blank themselves, deciding that a quiet black man raising a daughter alone, dressed simply and living without any visible sign of wealth, must be exactly the failure they had always expected him to become. None of them ever considered that silence could mean something other than defeat. 16 years later, Brad found himself in charge of organizing their 20-year reunion, and somewhere in the alumni database he came across Lance's name attached to almost no information at all. He learned that Naomi had passed away, that Lance was raising a teenage daughter on his own, and he decided this was the perfect opportunity to remind everyone what kind of man Brad Collins had become. He proposed a fundraiser called Glenville Cares, framing it publicly as an act of generosity toward a struggling former classmate, while privately imagining exactly how good it would look to hand Lance an envelope in front of 300 people with cameras raised. The invitation arrived at Lance's office with a line added beneath the formal wording, assuring him that his and his daughter's dinner had already been paid for. A few days later, boxes of second-hand clothing and gift cards showed up at the same address, sent by people who had convinced themselves they were doing something kind. Lance understood exactly what was happening the moment he read it, and he set the invitation aside, fully intending to throw it away by the end of the week. Then Maya found an old yearbook photo, tucked inside a drawer she wasn't supposed to be going through, a picture of her father at 20 years old, thinner, unsmiling, standing at the edge of a group photo instead of inside it. She had never heard him talk about college, had never once heard the names of anyone he had known there. She asked him why. If these were his old friends, he had never mentioned a single one of them in 16 years, and Lance realized he didn't have an answer that wouldn't require telling her everything. That question sat with him longer than he expected it to. He could refuse the invitation, keep the past exactly where he had buried it, and protect Maya from people who had never deserved to know either of them. Or he could go back, let her see the place that shaped him before she knew anything about what he had built since, and trust that she was old enough to understand the difference between where someone starts and who they become. What none of the organizers realized, including Brad, was that the reunion had been booked at the Grand Glenville Hotel, the most prestigious venue in the city, purchased quietly 3 years earlier through a holding company that carried no trace of Lance's name. Nor did they know that Pinnacle Logistics, the regional distribution company where Brad now worked as a director, had been acquired by Lance's company nearly 2 years before. Brad had spent almost 2 years reporting, in effect, to a man he still believed was beneath him. Lance decided to attend, but not as the founder of Apex Global Systems. He wore a plain jacket, drove an unremarkable car, and walked through the hotel's front entrance holding his daughter's hand exactly the way any other father would. Before they stepped inside, he crouched slightly to meet Maya's eyes and told her that tonight she might see a version of him he had spent a long time trying to forget, but that nothing anyone said in that room had the power to decide what either of them was worth. He wasn't walking in to prove anything to Brad Collins. He was walking in to see, after 20 years, whether the people who had once made him invisible had changed at all, or whether they were still exactly who they used to be. The moment Lance and Maya stepped into the ballroom, Brad spotted them from across the room and moved toward them with the kind of enthusiasm that immediately felt rehearsed. He clasped Lance's hand a little too firmly, turned his head toward the nearest cluster of guests, and announced loud enough for half the room to hear that Lance had finally made it, and that he shouldn't worry about a thing tonight because everything was already taken care of. A few heads turned. Someone lifted a phone to capture the moment before anyone had said anything worth capturing. Brad reached behind him and produced a bag of donated clothing, pressing it into Maya's hands before she could say a word, even though she was wearing a deep green dress that Lance had picked out with her the week before, one she had chosen herself, after trying on nearly a dozen others. Brad didn't seem to notice or care what she was wearing. He caught the attention of a passing server and asked, within earshot of Lance, whether extra plates could be boxed up for the two of them to take home, the implication sitting heavily in the air that they might not have food waiting for them tomorrow. Not everyone in the room seemed comfortable with what was happening. Near the bar, a woman who had once taught alongside several of Lance's professors turned away rather than watch, and a man standing near the dessert table quietly excused himself to refill a drink he didn't need. But most of the room read the moment differently, several people nodding approvingly at Brad, telling him how good it was to see someone give back like this. Across the room, Derek Hayes stood near the wall with a drink he had stopped actually sipping from 10 minutes earlier, watching the exchange with an expression that didn't match the smiles around him. He shifted his weight forward once, as though he might walk over and say something, then thought better of it and stayed exactly where he was. Megan Walsh had her phone raised for most of it, narrating quietly into a live stream about how their graduating class was coming together to help an old friend who had fallen on hard times. She framed the shot carefully to include Brad's face as much as Lance's, and the comments beneath the stream filled quickly with hearts and messages calling Brad a good man. Nobody watching, in the room or on the screen, thought to ask Lance a single question about what he actually did for a living, or whether he had asked for any of this in the first place. Maya heard two women near the dessert table murmur something about how sweet it was that Brad was giving the poor father and daughter a night to remember, and her face changed in a way Lance caught out of the corner of his eye. She leaned toward him and asked quietly if they could just leave, and Lance told her to hold on a little longer, that he needed to see something through before they walked out that door. Across the room, Catherine Wells, the hotel's general manager, had already recognized him the second he crossed the entrance, and she approached under the pretense of checking on the room's catering, offering under her breath to end this immediately, if he wanted her to. Lance shook his head slightly and told her not yet. He wanted to know exactly how far people were willing to go when they believed the man in front of them had no power to stop them. What none of them could see, standing in that ballroom congratulating themselves on their generosity, was the version of Lance that existed in the years right after Naomi's death, sitting on the floor of a public library with a laptop balanced on his knees, and Maya's stroller parked beside the study table because the childcare he'd budgeted for had fallen through again that week. He had pitched his supply chain software to 11 different investors that year, and 8 of them had turned him down within the first 10 minutes, more than one of them saying, without much tact, that a single father raising a toddler alone wasn't someone they could trust to run a company under real pressure. One investor had told him flatly that he needed to choose, that fatherhood and founder life didn't mix, and Lance had simply thanked him for his time and left without arguing, because arguing wouldn't change anything and he had a bottle to prepare for Maya in 20 minutes anyway. He built anyway, coding after she fell asleep, taking calls from the library because his apartment had no reliable internet, teaching himself to read spreadsheets on cracked phone screens while pushing a stroller through grocery aisles. The idea itself had come from years earlier, back when he worked warehouse shifts during college and watched shipments of food and medicine get lost or delayed because the tracking systems in place were held together with outdated software and good intentions. He knew exactly where the failures were, because he had lived inside them, and he built something meant to close those gaps long before he had the money or the team to make it real. Gloria Whitfield was the 12th investor he pitched, and she was the first one who didn't ask him what he planned to do about childcare. She told him later, once they knew each other well enough for her to say it plainly, that she didn't see his daughter as a liability sitting in that meeting. She saw a man who had kept building something worth funding while carrying more weight than most founders she had met, and she decided that kind of endurance wasn't something money could manufacture. Her investment became the foundation Apex Global Systems was built on, and within a handful of years, the company had grown from a 2-person operation into a logistics platform used by hospitals, pharmaceutical distributors, and government agencies to move medicine and supplies across the country without the failures Lance had once witnessed firsthand. By the time Maya turned 10, Apex had been valued at more than $4 billion, though almost nobody outside a small circle of employees and investors knew Lance's name attached to any of it. He turned down magazine profiles, kept his photograph off every company page he could control, and registered most of his personal assets through holding companies specifically so that Maya could grow up without being defined as the daughter of a billionaire before she'd had the chance to define herself as anything at all. The quiet that people at Glenville mistook for failure had never been failure. It had been the exact opposite, deliberately hidden from view. Back in the ballroom, Brad had moved well past his second glass of wine and was growing louder with every story he told, most of them circling back to how broke Lance had been in college, how he used to eat alone, because nobody wanted to sit near him. He told the room there were people born to lead, and people who simply needed to learn how to accept help gracefully, glancing toward Lance as he said it, clearly proud of the line. Then his attention shifted to Maya, and he asked her, in front of everyone nearby, whether she was even planning on attending college, adding that the alumni fund could probably help cover tuition if her father couldn't manage it on his own. Maya answered evenly that her father had already taken care of her future, without raising her voice or looking away from him. Brad laughed at that, telling the people around him that it was sweet how kids repeated whatever pride their parents fed them, even when reality told a different story. He then gestured toward the large screen behind the stage and asked the technician to bring up a set of old photos he had apparently been saving for this exact moment. Some kind of tribute, he called it, to how far they'd all come since college. The first image showed Lance eating alone at a corner table in the Glenville dining hall, his tray untouched by anyone else at the table around him. The next showed his old locker with the words "class loser" scratched into the metal in permanent marker. A third showed the same threadbare jacket he had worn at graduation, and a fourth, taken without his knowledge at the time, showed him asleep at a library desk during finals week, exhausted in a way that had nothing performative about it. Brad had arranged them beside a photo taken just an hour earlier of Lance walking Maya through the hotel lobby, and beneath it he'd typed a caption that read, "20 years later, and some things never change." Maya stared at the screen for a long moment, seeing a version of her father she had never been shown, humiliated in front of a room full of strangers who had laughed instead of helping him. She turned to look at Lance and saw something in his face she rarely saw, a kind of quiet she now understood had been covering pain rather than peace. She asked, loud enough for a few people nearby to hear, why nobody in that room had ever stepped in to stop it, and nobody offered her an answer, not even Derek, who was still standing near the wall with his eyes fixed on the screen, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Brad seemed to take the silence as approval, and he decided the night had reached what he called its most meaningful moment. He invited Lance and Maya up onto the stage, and a staff member wheeled out an oversized printed check meant purely for photographs, while another handed Brad a real envelope containing the donations collected that evening. Brad held it out toward Lance with both hands, telling him this money would help with rent, with clothes for Maya, with starting over, and asked him, in front of the cameras now raised throughout the room, to say a few words of thanks to everyone who had made this possible. Lance took the envelope, looked at it for a moment, and then placed it back into Brad's hands, saying calmly that he didn't need it. Brad's expression shifted immediately from performative warmth into something sharper, and he told the room that Lance was letting his pride get in the way of what was best for his daughter, that some men would rather suffer quietly than admit they needed help. It wasn't the insult aimed at him that Lance felt most sharply. It was watching Brad drag Maya into it, using her as a prop to question whether her father was capable of taking care of her at all. Maya's eyes filled with tears on that stage, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden understanding that none of these people had ever truly known her father, not then and not now. Lance felt something inside him shift as he watched his daughter cry in front of 300 people who believed they were witnessing charity. He had spent 20 years choosing silence, telling himself it was dignity, but standing there under those lights, he understood that silence had stopped protecting either of them the moment Brad turned it into a weapon. He looked across the room to where Catherine Wells was standing near the entrance and gave her the smallest nod, one she had clearly been waiting for. Within seconds, the doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Catherine Wells walked in flanked by the hotel's legal director and 2 members of security, her heels striking the marble floor in a rhythm that cut through the noise of the room. She crossed directly to the stage without hesitating, and the microphone feedback screeched briefly as she reached for it, silencing the scattered laughter that had followed Brad's last comment. She told the room, calmly but firmly, that the organizers had used the image and likeness of a guest to solicit charitable donations without that guest's consent, and that the hotel could not allow the program to continue under those circumstances. Brad's face shifted from confusion to irritation almost instantly, and he told Catherine that he was the one who had booked the ballroom for the evening, which meant he had every right to run the program as he saw fit. Catherine looked at him for a moment before answering, her voice even and unhurried. She told him that he had booked the room, but that the man he had just spent the last hour humiliating happened to own the building they were all standing in. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the walls rather than simply fill them. Catherine turned toward Lance and addressed him as Chairman Norwood, the words landing with a weight that made several people in the front rows visibly straighten in their seats. Nobody in the room said anything for a few seconds, most of them glancing at each other as if checking whether anyone else had understood what she'd just said. A woman near the second table pulled out her phone immediately, and within moments others followed. typing his name into search bars with the kind of urgency reserved for something they were suddenly desperate to verify before they said another word out loud. The screen behind the stage, still displaying the humiliating photos Brad had arranged only minutes earlier, flickered and changed to a page showing ownership records for Meridian Holdings, the company that had quietly purchased the Grand Glenville Hotel 3 years before. Lance Norwood's name sat directly beneath the transaction details, positioned right next to the same photograph Brad had used to mock him only minutes earlier. A man near the back read part of it aloud without meaning to, his voice carrying further than he intended, and the murmur that followed spread outward in waves rather than all at once. One woman near the bar turned to the man beside her and asked if he had known any of this, her voice tight with disbelief, and he shook his head slowly, still staring at his own phone screen. Another guest, one of the few who had turned away earlier rather than watch Brad's display, read a portion of an article summary out loud to the small group around her, describing Apex Global Systems as a multi-billion-dollar logistics and technology company operating across several countries. The information didn't arrive all at once. It moved through the room in uneven bursts, each person catching up a few seconds behind the last, the collective realization tightening around the room like a slow exhale nobody had been ready to take. Brad tried to recover, telling the people nearest him that he had only ever meant to help an old friend who seemed to be struggling, that his intentions had been good even if the details were complicated. Lance looked at him directly for the first time since stepping off the stage earlier, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the stunned room. He asked Brad a simple question, one that required no elaboration. Had he ever at any point actually asked Lance whether he needed help? Brad opened his mouth to answer and found that he had nothing to say. Lance continued, his tone even, explaining to the room that Pinnacle Logistics, the company Brad worked for as a regional director, had been acquired by Apex Global Systems nearly 2 years earlier. He said that internal reviews conducted after the acquisition had already flagged a pattern of concerning behavior tied to Brad's management, including taking credit for work completed by employees under him, concealing performance issues from oversight teams, and using his position to intimidate staff who questioned his decisions. It was, Lance noted without raising his voice, essentially the same behavior Brad had practiced on him 20 years earlier, simply given a title and an office. He informed Brad, in front of the entire room, that he was suspending him from his position effective immediately, pending a formal audit that had already been authorized. Brad's face drained of color as the weight of it settled over him, and for the first time all evening nobody in the room moved to defend him. The people who had spent the last hour laughing along with his jokes and admiring his generosity now stood watching him with the same detached curiosity they might have given a stranger. Power, Lance had learned long ago, tended to evaporate the moment it stopped being useful to the people standing nearby, and Brad was discovering that same lesson in real time, on the very stage he had built to showcase his own kindness. But the larger reckoning in that ballroom had little to do with whether Brad kept his job. It had everything to do with the fact that nearly every person in that room now had to sit with the role they had played, however small, over the last 20 years and the last 2 hours. Some of them had actively taken part in isolating Lance during college, deliberately excluding him from the connections that might have made his early years easier. Others had laughed along without thinking much about it, treating cruelty as entertainment simply because someone louder than them had decided it was funny. Most had done nothing at all, choosing the comfort of staying quiet over the risk of standing out, the same choice Derek Hayes had made 20 years earlier and had never quite forgiven himself for. Lance told the room, without anger in his voice, that pity was not the same thing as kindness when it was used to make the person receiving it feel smaller. He said he had never needed anyone's donations, hadn't needed them tonight and hadn't needed them 20 years ago. What he had needed back then was simply one person willing to say out loud that what Brad was doing was wrong. There had been hundreds of students at Glenville during those 4 years, and in all that time, not a single one of them had ever done it. Derek stepped forward from where he had been standing near the wall for most of the evening, separating himself quietly from the small cluster of people who had gathered near Brad earlier in support. He didn't say anything loudly or dramatically. He simply walked up to Lance and told him, in a voice meant only for the two of them, that he had known exactly what was happening back then, had seen it happen more than once, and had never once said anything to stop it. He said he had thought about that silence more times over the years than he ever expected to, and that seeing it projected on a screen tonight had made it impossible to keep pretending he hadn't been part of it. Lance didn't answer him with forgiveness right away, because forgiveness offered too quickly wouldn't have meant much to either of them. He simply nodded and told Derek that acknowledging it, out loud and without excuses, was more than most people in that room had managed tonight. It wasn't absolution, but it was something honest, and honesty was the one thing that had been missing from every version of kindness performed in that ballroom that evening. Once the room had settled into something closer to stillness, Lance turned his attention back to the envelope still sitting on the table where Brad had left it. He didn't take it back for himself, and he didn't ask for the check to be reprinted with his name on it. Instead, he asked that the entire amount collected that evening be redirected into a scholarship fund for students who were raising children or caring for family members while attending college, the exact kind of support that might have changed something for him 20 years earlier had it existed. He added that Apex Global Systems would match the fund at 100 times the amount raised that night, a gesture that drew a few audible gasps from people still holding their phones. He named the fund after Naomi Carter Norwood, the woman who had seen something worth believing in long before he had anything to show for it. He explained to Maya, standing beside him with her eyes still red from crying earlier, that success meant very little if it was only ever used to make other people feel small. Brad had used money to manufacture gratitude and dependence. Lance intended to use it to give people a chance at something they wouldn't have to lower themselves to receive. A handful of former classmates approached afterward, some of them offering apologies that sounded rehearsed, clearly more concerned with easing their own discomfort than acknowledging what had actually happened. Lance listened to each of them politely, accepting the ones that carried real weight, particularly Derek's, while making it clear that a few sentences delivered under pressure didn't erase 2 decades of silence. Megan Walsh approached separately, already scrolling to delete the live stream from her account, offering to post something correcting the record. Lance told her plainly that he didn't want his daughter's night turned into content a second time, regardless of the intention behind it. Catherine asked Brad to leave the stage, and this time nobody objected or tried to laugh the moment away. The people who had surrounded him all evening, eager to be seen standing near his generosity, had already drifted elsewhere, leaving him alone in the middle of a room he had spent hours trying to control. For the first time that night, Brad Collins looked exactly like what he had accused Lance of being years earlier, and no one in that room seemed inclined to save him from it. Outside the hotel, the evening air felt sharp after the heat of the ballroom, and a line of black cars from Apex waited near the entrance, though Lance didn't move toward them right away. Maya asked him quietly why he had never told her how much he was actually worth, and Lance told her that he wanted her to know who he was before she ever learned what he owned. She considered that for a moment, then asked why he had bothered coming tonight at all, knowing they had only invited him out of pity. Lance admitted that he had told himself, walking in, that he was coming back to prove Brad wrong. Standing outside now, he realized the real reason had always been about her, about making sure she never grew up believing she had to accept anyone else's judgment as the truth of who she was. Maya reached for his hand the way she used to when she was small, and together they walked toward the car waiting to take them home. Back inside the ballroom, the screen behind the stage still displayed 2 images side by side, left untouched by anyone who might have thought to change them. On one side stood a photograph of Lance at 20 years old, eating alone, dressed in clothes that had embarrassed no one but the people who mocked him for wearing them. On the other side sat the announcement of a new scholarship fund worth millions of dollars, carrying the name of a woman who had believed in him before he had anything to offer proof of. The people who had once invited him back out of pity finally understood that the man they had tried to save had never needed saving at all. For 20 years he had quietly built an empire and raised a daughter almost entirely on his own, and in doing so had become someone capable of opening doors for thousands of people he would never meet. His greatest achievement was never the billions his company was worth. It was the fact that he never let the cruelty of others turn him into a man without room left for kindness of his own. If this story reminded you that quiet doesn't mean weak, and that kindness should never come with a price tag on someone else's dignity, that's exactly the kind of story we love telling here. Subscribe if you want more like this one, and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Lance's shoes. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.